It was just another sunny morning in San Francisco as Jason Monroe stood by the big glass windows, looking out at the bright sky and the planes on the runway. Tall and with a calm, steady gaze, he looked like any other traveler waiting for his flight. His quiet demeanor and neatly dressed look didn't really make him stand out. In fact, people rarely paid him much attention. But that's the way Jason liked it. He preferred to go unnoticed. He wasn't one to show off, even though he could. Today, however, was a little different. Jason felt a strange mix of emotions as he waited. Something in the air felt off. He took a deep breath and let his mind wander for a moment. He knew he'd soon be boarding his flight, a routine flight he had taken many times before. But as he scanned the busy airport lounge, he noticed the usual signs: the crowded seats, the clamor of travelers, the buzzing conversations. It all seemed ordinary, but there was a hint of tension, something that Jason, with his quiet, observant nature, picked up on right away. As he waited, a group of flight attendants walked by, laughing and chatting, their uniforms crisp and tidy. Jason's eyes followed them for a moment. He had spent years working with people like them. He knew the job was hard. Long hours, lots of pressure, endless faces passing by, and hardly a chance to make a personal connection. Some people managed to stay polite and kind, even after years of dealing with difficult passengers and stressful days. But others let the pressure get to them. They became colder, harsher, sometimes even a bit arrogant. Jason had seen both kinds of people. He knew what it was like to feel invisible, like he didn't really matter to anyone. As he watched the flight attendants, his gaze rested on one in particular. She was tall, with a sharp, no-nonsense expression, and she walked with a certain stiffness that suggested she was used to being in charge. Her name tag read Miss Henderson, and she held her head high, her eyes scanning the crowd as if she were looking for something or someone who didn't belong. Jason's eyes narrowed slightly. He recognized that type. People who always assumed they knew everything about a person, just by looking at them. He'd dealt with people like Miss Henderson before. It was a quiet irritation he had learned to live with. As he thought about this, Jason's gaze drifted away from the attendants, and he turned his attention to the other travelers around him. Families with kids, business people typing away on their laptops, couples snapping selfies. He enjoyed people watching, observing the different personalities, guessing their stories. His quiet, thoughtful nature made him good at this. He was a listener, an observer. And though he rarely spoke about it, Jason carried a story too. A story that few people knew. A story that, if people knew it, might change the way they looked at him. But for now, Jason was just another traveler. He looked down at his boarding pass, checked the gate number, and made his way to the line, moving through the crowd with a calm, steady pace. As he waited in line, he noticed Miss Henderson again. She was stationed near the boarding gate, checking tickets and greeting passengers. Her expression was calm but slightly stern, the kind of look that dared you to step out of line. When it was Jason's turn, he handed over his ticket with a polite nod, expecting to pass through smoothly like everyone else. But Miss Henderson barely glanced at the ticket before her eyes traveled up and down, taking in his clothes, his casual manner, his calm expression. She didn't smile, and her eyes narrowed slightly. "You know this line is for priority boarding, right?" she said, her tone sharp. "If you're in economy, the line is over there." She pointed to a longer line off to the side. Jason paused for a moment, surprised by her tone, but kept his expression neutral. He didn't want to make a scene. Calmly, he replied, "Yes, I'm in the right line." Miss Henderson raised an eyebrow, clearly doubting him, but checked his ticket anyway. As her eyes scanned the details, she blinked, a small flash of surprise crossing her face, before she quickly masked it with her usual stern expression. She handed the ticket back, her mouth set in a tight line. "Very well," she said, her tone cool. "Enjoy your flight." Jason nodded politely and walked through, but he could feel the weight of her gaze following him. As he took his seat, He couldn't shake the feeling of her judgment, the way she had looked at him as though he didn't belong. It wasn't the first time he'd faced that kind of reaction, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. As he settled into his seat, Jason's mind wandered back to his journey, to the long road that had led him to where he was today. He thought of the countless flights he had taken, the endless hours of training, the tests, the early mornings and late nights, the moments of self-doubt, and the triumphs that had brought him here. To most people, he was just another passenger, another face in the crowd. But Jason had worked hard, harder than most, to reach his position. He glanced around the cabin, observing the other passengers. He could see a few familiar faces, people he recognized from previous flights. They gave him polite nods, but he knew they didn't really know him, didn't see the full story. And that was fine. He didn't need anyone's admiration or approval. He was comfortable with himself, comfortable with the quiet confidence that came from years of experience, from knowing his own worth. But as the plane began to fill, Jason noticed Miss Henderson again. She was moving down the aisle, checking on passengers, her eyes scanning the cabin with a critical gaze. As she passed by his seat, her eyes lingered on him for a moment, just long enough for Jason to feel the weight of her scrutiny. She didn't say anything, but her expression spoke volumes. It was as if she couldn't quite believe he was there, as if she were waiting for him to reveal some flaw, some reason why he didn't belong. Jason met her gaze calmly, refusing to look away. He knew what she was thinking. He had seen it in the eyes of countless people before her. People who made snap judgments, who assumed they knew everything about him without knowing anything at all. He had learned to brush it off, to let their assumptions roll off his back. But today, he felt a flicker of frustration. Why did people like her always assume the worst? Why did they look at him and see only what they wanted to see? As the plane took off, Jason closed his eyes, letting the familiar hum of the engine soothe his mind. He thought about the people he had met over the years, the friends and mentors who had supported him, the challenges he had overcome. He knew that his story was one of resilience, of quiet strength and determination, and though he rarely spoke about it, he carried that story with him every day, a story that defined him, even if others couldn't see it. The flight passed smoothly, and Jason kept to himself, watching the clouds drift by through the window, lost in thought. But every now and then, he felt Miss Henderson's gaze on him, a cold, questioning stare that reminded him of all the times he had been underestimated, all the times people had looked at him and seen only what they wanted to see. As the plane began its descent, Jason took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever awaited him. He knew that he would face more people like Miss Henderson, more people who would look at him and see only the surface, who would make judgments without knowing the full story. But he also knew that he was more than their assumptions, more than their narrow perspectives. And as the plane touched down, Jason felt a quiet, steady resolve settle over him. He would keep going, keep pushing forward, no matter who doubted him, no matter who tried to hold him back. Because he knew his own worth, knew the strength that lay beneath the surface. And that was all he needed. Jason adjusted the strap of his bag as he approached the boarding area. The airport was busy, filled with people of all backgrounds and purposes. Some were business travelers, others were families going on vacation. But for Jason, this flight was just another part of his job, another leg in a long journey he was all too familiar with. As he stepped forward, he caught sight of Miss Henderson again. She was stationed near the boarding gate, standing tall and serious. She wore the typical airline uniform, neat and pressed, her blonde hair pulled back tightly, her expression almost severe. Her gaze scanned the line of passengers with a sharpness that suggested she didn't tolerate any nonsense. Jason could see she was the type who liked order, who liked things to go her way, and who didn't have much patience for anything or anyone that might disrupt her routine. When Jason reached the front of the line, he gave Miss Henderson a polite nod and handed her his ticket. She glanced at it briefly, but didn't seem to really look at the details. Instead, her eyes moved to Jason's face, then down to his clothes, then back to his face again. It was the kind of look that made Jason feel as if he were being judged, assessed, and dismissed, all within a few seconds. "You must be in the wrong line," she said, her tone flat, almost dismissive. She pointed toward the line for economy class, where a crowd of passengers waited. "This line is for priority boarding. Economy is over there." Jason felt a slight wave of embarrassment wash over him, but he kept his face calm. He knew that reacting would only make things worse. He took a deep breath, reminded himself to stay steady, and replied politely, "I'm in the right line." Miss Henderson's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. She seemed taken aback by his calm response, as if she had expected him to apologize and hurry away. For a brief moment, she hesitated, and Jason could see her uncertainty. But then she straightened her shoulders, as if reinforcing her authority, and checked the ticket more closely. When she saw his boarding status, her expression changed just a little, a quick flash of surprise, quickly hidden behind her usual stern demeanor. She handed the ticket back, but her tone remained cold and distant. "Very well," she said. "Enjoy your flight." Jason nodded politely, not wanting to give her any reason to think he was offended or upset. He walked through the gate and onto the plane, feeling her eyes on him the entire time. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered people like her, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. People who thought they knew everything about him with just one look, who made assumptions based on his appearance, his quiet demeanor, his polite, unassuming nature. They didn't see the whole story. They didn't see who he really was, what he was capable of. As he entered the cabin and found his seat, Jason let out a small sigh, allowing himself a moment to relax. He settled into his seat, placing his bag in the overhead compartment and taking a deep breath. The cabin was filling up, passengers chatting, flight attendants moving around, checking bags, offering assistance. He leaned back and closed his eyes, hoping to get a little rest before the flight took off. But just as he was starting to relax, he heard a familiar voice nearby. Opening his eyes, he saw Miss Henderson standing a few rows ahead, talking to one of the other passengers. Her tone was pleasant enough, but Jason could sense the underlying tension in her voice, the way her words seemed to carry an unspoken message. It was as if she were trying to keep control, trying to maintain her authority over the situation. She finished her conversation and continued down the aisle, her eyes scanning the passengers, looking for any sign of trouble or disorder. When she reached Jason's row, she paused, her gaze lingering on him for a moment. She didn't say anything, but her expression was enough. It was the same look she had given him at the gate, a look of doubt, of judgment, as if she were still trying to figure him out, still trying to understand why he was in a seat that, in her eyes, didn't belong to someone like him. Jason met her gaze calmly, refusing to look away. He knew what she was thinking. He had seen that look countless times before. People who saw him and assumed they knew everything about him. People who didn't bother to look beyond the surface, to see the person beneath. It was a look he had learned to ignore, a look he had learned to rise above. Miss Henderson's gaze lingered for a few more seconds before she turned and continued down the aisle, her expression unchanged. Jason watched her go, feeling a mixture of frustration and pity. He knew that people like her lived in a narrow world, a world where appearances and assumptions ruled, where they didn't take the time to really see people for who they were. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Jason settled back into his seat, closing his eyes once again, trying to push away the frustration that lingered in his mind. But he couldn't shake the feeling of Miss Henderson's gaze, the weight of her judgment, the subtle way she had tried to remind him of his place. It was a reminder of all the times he had been underestimated, all the times people had looked at him and seen only what they wanted to see, without ever trying to understand the truth. The flight attendants finished their final checks, and the plane began to taxi down the runway. Jason opened his eyes and looked out the window, watching as the ground slowly fell away, replaced by the endless sky. The familiar hum of the engines filled the cabin, a comforting sound that reminded him of his years in the air, the countless flights he had taken, the journeys that had shaped him into the person he was today. But as the plane climbed higher, he couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration, a lingering sense of injustice. He had worked hard to get where he was, to prove himself, to overcome the doubts and obstacles that had been placed in his path. And yet, here he was, still facing the same assumptions, the same judgments, the same quiet, subtle prejudice that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Miss Henderson continued to move through the cabin, checking on passengers, offering drinks, her expression always calm and controlled. But every now and then, Jason would catch her glancing his way, a brief, questioning look that reminded him of her earlier judgment, her earlier attempt to place him in a box that he didn't belong in. As the flight went on, Jason tried to focus on his own thoughts, tried to push away the tension that lingered in the air, but it was hard to ignore the presence of someone who seemed so determined to doubt him, to see him as something he was not. He felt a quiet, steady anger building inside him, a reminder of all the times he had been underestimated, all the times people had looked at him and seen only what they wanted to see. But despite the tension, despite the subtle looks and unspoken judgments, Jason remained calm. He knew who he was, knew his own worth, knew that he didn't need anyone else's approval to feel confident in himself. He had faced people like Miss Henderson before, and he knew he would face them again. But he also knew that he had the strength to rise above their doubts, to prove them wrong, not with words, but with actions. As the plane continued its journey, Jason allowed himself a small smile, a quiet expression of his own inner strength. He knew that he didn't need to prove anything to Miss Henderson, didn't need to justify his presence or his position. He was comfortable in his own skin, comfortable with the quiet confidence that came from years of hard work, from knowing his own worth. And as the flight went on, he resolved to stay true to himself, to remain calm and steady, no matter what challenges lay ahead. He knew that his journey was far from over, that there would be more obstacles to face, more people like Miss Henderson who would doubt him, who would try to place him in a box. But he also knew that he had the strength to rise above it all, to remain true to himself, to keep moving forward, no matter what. Jason knew that the world was full of people who would judge him, who would doubt him, who would try to hold him back. But he also knew that he had the strength to rise above it all, to prove them wrong, not with words, but with actions. And as the plane continued its journey, he felt a quiet, steady resolve settle over him, a reminder of who he was and what he stood for. He was Jason Monroe, and he was stronger than anyone's doubts or judgments. Jason sat quietly in his seat, his eyes focused out the window as the plane glided above the clouds. He felt the hum of the engines through his seat, a familiar sound that usually comforted him. Flying had always been a part of his life. He had been on countless flights, seen endless skies, and met all types of people. But today, there was an unusual tension in the air. It was a feeling he couldn't quite shake. As he sat there, he thought back to his earlier interaction with Miss Henderson, the flight attendant who had treated him with such coldness. Her words had been sharp, her tone dismissive, her eyes full of judgment. She had looked at him as if he didn't belong, as if he were somehow out of place. Jason could feel the weight of her assumptions, the unspoken beliefs she held about him. It was something he had experienced before, something he was all too familiar with. But Jason didn't react. He didn't show any sign of frustration or anger. Instead, he remained calm, keeping his emotions steady, his mind clear. He knew that people like Miss Henderson saw only what they wanted to see. They didn't look beyond the surface, didn't take the time to understand the truth. And he wasn't going to let her small-mindedness ruin his day or his journey. Throughout the first part of the flight, Jason noticed Miss Henderson moving up and down the aisle, checking on passengers, offering drinks, and making polite conversation. Her tone was friendly, even warm, with certain passengers. She smiled at them, asked if they were comfortable, if they needed anything else. But whenever she passed by Jason, her demeanor changed. Her face turned cold, her eyes narrowed slightly, and she barely looked at him. It was as if she were pretending he wasn't there, as if he were invisible to her. Jason took note of each interaction, observing the way she treated others compared to the way she treated him. He noticed the subtle shifts in her body language, the way her shoulders tensed when she walked past his seat, the slight frown that appeared whenever she glanced in his direction. He could feel her discomfort, her reluctance to acknowledge him, to offer him the same respect she showed the other passengers. But still, Jason didn't react. He kept his face calm, his body relaxed, letting her actions roll off his back like water. He knew that reacting would only give her satisfaction, would only reinforce whatever judgments she had already made about him. Instead, he chose to remain patient, to observe, to wait. About an hour into the flight, Miss Henderson began to serve the in-flight snacks and drinks. She moved down the aisle with a cart, handing out beverages and small packets of nuts, her smile bright and polite as she spoke to each passenger. Jason watched her as she approached his row, her expression cool and controlled, her movements precise. When she reached his seat, she barely glanced at him before handing him a cup of water and a packet of peanuts. "Here," she said shortly, her tone clipped. She didn't ask if he wanted anything else, didn't offer him a choice of drink like she had with the other passengers. It was a small thing, but Jason noticed it. He noticed the way her hand moved quickly, as if she couldn't wait to move on, as if she didn't want to spend a second longer than necessary in his presence. Jason accepted the water and peanuts with a polite nod, keeping his expression neutral. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice calm and steady. He didn't let any hint of frustration show. He simply watched her, his eyes calm and thoughtful, as she turned and moved on to the next row, her back stiff, her steps brisk. As the flight continued, Jason noticed more of these small actions, these tiny gestures that revealed Miss Henderson's true feelings. She avoided his gaze whenever she passed by, barely acknowledging his presence. When she spoke to the passengers around him, her voice was friendly and polite, but when she addressed him, her tone turned cold, distant. It was as if she were putting up a wall, a barrier that kept him at a distance, as if she didn't want to connect with him on any level. But Jason remained patient. He knew that people like her often believed they held all the power, that they could treat others however they pleased without consequence. He knew that Miss Henderson probably thought she could get away with her coldness, her dismissiveness, her quiet prejudice. She probably thought that he would accept it, that he would sit quietly and let her treat him however she wanted. But Jason was not as passive as he seemed. He might have been calm, might have been patient, but he was also observant. He noticed each dismissive gesture, each cold glance, each demeaning word. He took mental notes, cataloging her actions in his mind, storing away every detail. He knew that there would come a time when her actions would have consequences, a moment when her behavior would be called into question. And when that time came, he would be ready. As the hours passed, Jason continued to observe her, watching the way she interacted with others, the way she seemed to divide people into categories based on her own judgments and assumptions. He could see that she was friendly and warm with certain passengers, particularly those who fit a certain image, those who looked a certain way. But with others, she was distant, cold, almost rude. Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration, a quiet anger that simmered beneath the surface. He had encountered people like Miss Henderson before, people who saw the world in narrow terms, who judged others based on appearances, who believed that they could treat certain people with disrespect simply because they didn't fit into their preconceived notions. But instead of letting his frustration show, Jason kept his emotions in check, keeping his face calm, his body relaxed. He knew that reacting would only give her more reason to look down on him, more reason to feel superior. And he wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, he waited, observing, watching, his mind calm and focused. At one point, Miss Henderson passed by his seat again, her eyes flicking over him briefly before she looked away. Jason noticed the way she seemed to avoid looking directly at him, as if she couldn't bear to acknowledge his presence. It was a subtle thing, but it spoke volumes. It revealed her discomfort, her unease, her reluctance to see him as an equal. Jason took a deep breath, letting the feeling of frustration wash over him before letting it go. He reminded himself that her actions, her judgments, didn't define him. He knew his own worth, knew who he was, and he wasn't going to let her small-mindedness affect his sense of self. As the plane continued on its journey, Jason felt a quiet resolve building within him, a determination to remain patient, to wait for the right moment. He knew that the time would come when the truth would be revealed, when Miss Henderson's behavior would be exposed for what it was. And when that time came, he would be ready to stand tall, to show her that he was more than her assumptions, more than her judgments. In the meantime, he remained calm, observing her actions, taking note of each small slight, each dismissive gesture. He could feel the tension building, a quiet, simmering conflict that lay beneath the surface, a conflict that would eventually come to a head. But for now, he waited, patient and steady, knowing that the time for action would come soon enough. And as he sat there, watching the clouds drift by outside the window, he felt a sense of quiet strength, a reminder that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He knew who he was, knew his own worth, and he wasn't going to let anyone, least of all someone like Miss Henderson, make him feel less than he was. Jason knew that the world was full of people who judged, people who looked at others and saw only what they wanted to see. But he also knew that he was stronger than their judgments, stronger than their narrow-mindedness. And as the flight continued, he felt a quiet, steady resolve growing within him, a reminder of his own strength, his own resilience. He would wait. He would be patient. And when the time came, he would be ready to reveal the truth. As the flight continued, Jason sat calmly in his seat, aware of the quiet tension that had been growing since takeoff. He had endured the cold stares, the dismissive tone, the small but constant reminders from Miss Henderson that she did not see him as an equal. Her every word, every glance, seemed to hold a silent message, a message that told him he didn't belong, that he was somehow lesser, not worthy of respect. But Jason had learned to keep his calm. He had trained himself to let these things pass over him, like waves crashing against a steady rock. Still, as the hours passed, he could feel a weight growing inside him. He knew that Miss Henderson, with all her judgment and assumptions, thought she had power over him, that she could treat him however she wanted without consequence. She was so sure of herself, so certain in her authority. But Jason knew the truth. He knew who he was, knew the position he held, knew that he carried a power that went far beyond the surface. Miss Henderson continued her rounds, her steps brisk and her demeanor cold. Whenever she passed by Jason, she barely glanced at him, treating him as though he were invisible, as though he didn't matter. She attended to other passengers with warmth, with courtesy, making sure they were comfortable and content. But with Jason, there was only indifference, only a silent reminder of her low opinion of him. Jason noticed every small act, every subtle gesture, and he remained patient, waiting for the right moment. Toward the end of the flight, the cabin began to settle. Passengers were relaxing, some dozing off, others flipping through magazines or looking out the windows. Jason took a deep breath, feeling the familiar pull of the engines as the plane began its gradual descent. The flight had gone smoothly, and they would be landing soon. But Jason knew there was something important he needed to do before they reached the ground. He stood up slowly, stretching his legs and glancing around the cabin. Miss Henderson was up ahead, speaking to a passenger in a friendly tone, her expression calm and confident. She was in her element, completely at ease, certain in her authority. Jason could see the satisfaction in her face, the quiet arrogance that came from knowing she held power, or at least believing she did. Jason walked down the aisle, his movements calm and controlled, his face expressionless. He knew that he needed to approach this moment with care, that he needed to reveal the truth in a way that would make an impact, that would shift the dynamics of power in an undeniable way. He approached the front of the cabin, glancing back at the passengers as he moved. Some of them looked up, curious. wondering what he was doing, but he didn't stop, didn't let his pace falter. When he reached the cockpit door, he paused, taking a deep breath and steadying himself. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he would reveal the truth, not just to Miss Henderson, but to everyone on the plane. He placed his hand on the door, feeling the familiar weight of it, the solidness that represented the responsibility he carried. He opened the door and stepped inside, his movements sure and confident. The co-pilot looked up, nodding in greeting, his expression calm. They had flown together many times before, and there was a silent understanding between them, a mutual respect that needed no words. Jason took his seat, adjusting his headset and preparing for the announcement. He knew that his voice, steady and calm, would be heard throughout the cabin, that every passenger, every crew member would hear him. He pressed the button for the intercom, feeling the surge of quiet satisfaction as he spoke the words that would reveal his true identity, his true position. His voice echoed through the cabin, calm and steady, filled with an authority that could not be ignored. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone even and controlled, "this is your captain speaking. I'd like to personally thank you for flying with us today. We'll be making our descent shortly and should be landing soon." There was a moment of silence in the cabin, a brief pause as the passengers processed his words. Gasps filled the air, and Jason could sense the shock spreading through the cabin like a wave. He knew that his voice was unexpected, that the passengers, and especially Miss Henderson, had not anticipated hearing him in this role, in this position of authority. Jason glanced through the small window in the cockpit door, catching a glimpse of the reactions in the cabin. Miss Henderson was standing frozen in the aisle, her face pale, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of shock and confusion. She looked as if she had been struck by lightning, as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Jason could see the truth dawning on her, could see her realizing that all her assumptions, all her judgments, had been wrong. Slowly, he stood up and opened the cockpit door, stepping out into the aisle. He walked calmly toward Miss Henderson, his eyes meeting hers, his expression steady. He could see the panic in her face, the way her hands trembled slightly, the way she took a small step back as he approached. For the first time, she seemed unsure, her confidence shaken, her arrogance shattered. Jason stopped in front of her, holding her gaze, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. He didn't need to say anything, didn't need to explain. His presence, his uniform, his role as the captain of the flight, spoke louder than any words. Miss Henderson's face turned red, her eyes filled with a mix of embarrassment and regret. She looked down, unable to meet his gaze, unable to face the reality of her actions, of her judgments. The other passengers were watching, their eyes wide with shock and admiration. Jason could feel their respect, their silent acknowledgement of his position, of the power he held. He nodded to Miss Henderson, a small polite gesture, and then turned to address the passengers, his voice calm and composed. "Thank you all for your cooperation during the flight," he said, his tone respectful and steady. "It's been a pleasure serving as your captain today, and I hope you all have a safe and pleasant journey once we land." He could see the passengers nodding, could feel their respect, their admiration. They saw him now for who he truly was, saw the strength and authority he carried. And he knew that they, unlike Miss Henderson, understood his worth, understood that he was more than the assumptions people made about him. Jason turned back to Miss Henderson, meeting her gaze one last time. He could see the regret in her eyes, the silent apology that she couldn't bring herself to say. But he didn't need her words. He didn't need her apology. He knew that he had proven his worth, that he had shown her, and everyone else, who he truly was, and that was enough. As he walked back to the cockpit, he felt a sense of satisfaction, a sense of justice. He knew that he had not only revealed the truth, but had also reminded everyone on the plane of the importance of respect, of understanding, of looking beyond appearances. He had shown them the power of patience, the strength of quiet resilience, and the value of staying true to oneself. The plane continued its descent, and Jason took his seat in the cockpit once more, preparing for the landing. He felt a sense of calm, a sense of peace. He knew that he had faced Miss Henderson's judgments with dignity, had risen above her prejudice, and had revealed his true identity in a way that left no room for doubt. As the plane touched down, Jason felt a quiet pride, a satisfaction that came from knowing he had shown the truth, that he had proven himself not through anger or confrontation, but through calm, quiet strength. He knew that Miss Henderson and everyone else on the plane would remember this flight, would remember the lesson he had taught them, and he knew that he had done so with grace, with dignity, and with the quiet power that came from knowing his own worth. And as he stepped off the plane, he walked tall, knowing that he had not only revealed the truth, but had also reminded everyone, including Miss Henderson, of the importance of respect, of understanding, and of looking beyond appearances. He had shown them the strength of patience, the power of resilience, and the value of knowing one's true worth. And in that moment, he knew that he had not only earned their respect, but had also reminded them of a deeper truth, that true strength comes from within, and that those who judge others based on appearances are often the ones who never see the full story. The plane touched down smoothly, and as it taxied to the gate, Jason felt a deep sense of satisfaction and peace within him. This had been more than just another flight. It had been a reminder to everyone on board about respect, dignity, and the importance of seeing people for who they truly are, not just based on surface judgments. He was used to flying under the radar, going unnoticed, but today he had shown his true self, and it had left a lasting mark. As the plane slowed to a halt, there was a buzz among the passengers. Conversations were hushed but intense, as people whispered about the surprise reveal. They had all seen him sitting among them, looking like just another traveler, calm and unassuming. But then, he had stood at the front as the captain, with all the authority and grace of a true leader. It was a moment that no one on the plane would forget anytime soon. Jason unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and adjusted his uniform. His fellow flight crew looked at him with a newfound respect, their eyes wide, their expressions respectful. They had worked with him before, but today they saw him differently. Today, they understood the patience and quiet strength he carried with him every day. He met their gazes with a nod and a warm smile, acknowledging the respect they were silently showing him. Miss Henderson, on the other hand, was still standing in the aisle, looking utterly shaken. Her face was pale, her eyes downcast. She avoided meeting Jason's gaze, clearly embarrassed and deeply aware of the mistake she had made. She seemed to shrink in her uniform, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. The cold, superior attitude she had shown throughout the flight had crumbled, replaced by a look of regret and shame. Jason took a deep breath, his heart steady. He knew he had already said all he needed to say, but there was still a part of him that wanted to ensure that the lesson from this flight would last. He walked down the aisle, glancing at the passengers as he passed, giving them a friendly smile. Many of them nodded in appreciation, showing their gratitude for the respectful, dignified way he had handled everything. They admired not only his professionalism, but also the calm strength he had displayed in dealing with Miss Henderson's attitude. As he reached the front of the cabin, he turned to address the passengers. He spoke with a calm, steady voice, each word carrying a weight of sincerity and meaning. "Thank you, everyone, for flying with us today. I hope this journey has been comfortable and safe for you. Here at our airline, we are committed to respect, dignity, and equality. Every person who steps onto our planes deserves to be treated with kindness and understanding. We believe that these values are what make us stronger, what make us truly great." The passengers listened intently, nodding along. Some looked thoughtfully at Miss Henderson, as if they too understood the deeper message Jason was sharing. Others simply listened, taking in the words and feeling a newfound respect for the man standing before them. Jason continued, his voice filled with quiet strength. It's important to remember that each person has a story. Each person carries something valuable within them, and we should always approach one another with that understanding. Thank you for your attention, and I wish each of you a safe and happy journey ahead." As he finished, there was a brief moment of silence, and then the cabin erupted in applause. The passengers clapped and cheered, showing their respect and admiration for the message he had shared. Jason felt a sense of warmth fill him, a sense of peace knowing that his words had made an impact. This wasn't about proving himself, it was about reminding everyone, including Miss Henderson, of the values that truly matter. Miss Henderson stood off to the side, her face flushed with embarrassment, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked around at the applauding passengers, clearly aware that they all knew what had happened, that they all understood the lesson Jason had taught. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. She had spent the entire flight treating Jason as if he were invisible, as if he didn't matter. And now, here he was, being celebrated, admired, respected by everyone on board. Jason turned to Miss Henderson, his expression calm and composed. He didn't need to say anything more, but he gave her a small, understanding nod, a gesture that spoke volumes. It was a nod that said he forgave her, that he held no bitterness or anger, but that he hoped she would remember this moment, that she would take this lesson to heart. He wanted her to know that respect and kindness were values that went far beyond uniforms, titles, or appearances. As he looked at her, he could see the regret in her eyes, the silent acknowledgement that she had been wrong. She gave him a small nod in return, her expression one of remorse. She seemed humbled, her arrogance and pride stripped away, replaced by a quiet understanding of her own mistake. Jason felt a sense of closure, knowing that she had received the message, that she would carry this experience with her. The plane's doors opened, and the passengers began to gather their belongings, preparing to disembark. One by one, they passed by Jason, some offering words of gratitude, others simply giving him a respectful nod. A few shook his hand, expressing their admiration for the way he had handled everything. Jason thanked each of them, his heart full of warmth and satisfaction. As Miss Henderson prepared to leave, she paused in front of Jason, looking up at him with an expression of uncertainty. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it, as though struggling to find the right words. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Captain, I apologize. I was wrong to judge you. I didn't see the whole picture." Jason nodded, his expression gentle. "Thank you, Miss Henderson," he said simply. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." She nodded, a look of gratitude in her eyes, and with a final glance, she turned and walked off the plane. Jason watched her go, feeling a sense of peace, knowing that he had handled the situation with dignity and grace. He hadn't needed to raise his voice, hadn't needed to argue or prove himself. He had simply shown his true self, and that had been enough. After everyone had disembarked, Jason gathered his belongings, his heart light, and his mind calm. He knew that today had been an important day, a day that had reminded him of the strength that came from patience, from quiet resilience. He had reclaimed his dignity, had earned the respect of those around him, not through force, but through kindness, through understanding, and through staying true to himself. As he walked through the airport, he could feel the looks of admiration from those who had been on the flight, a silent acknowledgement of his strength and integrity. He knew that he had made an impact, that he had shown them a different kind of power, a power that didn't come from titles or uniforms, but from a deep inner strength, from a quiet confidence that couldn't be shaken. Jason left the airport with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had taught a valuable lesson, not just to Miss Henderson, but to everyone who had witnessed the events of that flight. He had shown them that true respect was earned, not demanded, and that kindness and understanding were the foundations of true strength. As he drove home, he felt a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction that stayed with him long after he had left the airport behind. He knew that he had done more than just stand up for himself. He had shown everyone that true dignity came from within, and that those who judged others based on appearances were often the ones who needed to learn the most. In the days that followed, Jason continued his work with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying the lesson of that flight with him. He knew that there would always be people who judged, who made assumptions, who treated others unfairly. But he also knew that he had the strength to rise above it, to remain true to himself, and to show the world that respect, kindness, and understanding were the true markers of greatness. And with each flight he took, each journey he embarked on, he carried with him the quiet strength that had earned him the respect of his passengers, his crew, and even those who had once doubted him. He knew that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone, because he knew his own worth, and that was all he needed. As Jason walked out of the airport that day, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders, a feeling of quiet pride filling his heart. It wasn't the kind of pride that came from showing off or seeking applause. It was a deeper, gentler pride, one that came from knowing he had stayed true to himself. He had faced judgment, disrespect, and prejudice, but he hadn't let it change who he was. Instead, he had remained calm, patient, and confident in his own worth. The journey on that flight wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about teaching everyone, including himself, a valuable lesson about respect, patience, and strength. In his calm and quiet way, Jason had shown that true dignity comes from within. He didn't need to shout, he didn't need to argue, and he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His actions spoke louder than any words, revealing the truth with a strength that only quiet resilience could bring. As he reflected on everything that had happened, he realized that this experience was about much more than just one flight or one person's judgment. It was about the way we see each other, the way we choose to treat one another, and the assumptions we make without even realizing it. Miss Henderson had judged him based on his appearance, based on her limited view of who he was. But in the end, she had been given a chance to see beyond that, to understand that people are far more than what they appear on the surface. Jason knew that everyone, at some point, faces judgment. Everyone has moments where they feel underestimated, moments where others look at them and make quick assumptions. It's an unfortunate part of human nature, this tendency to judge, to place people into boxes based on what little we see. But he also knew that each person has the power to rise above those judgments, to prove their worth through actions, through patience, and through quiet strength. The lesson Jason took away from this experience was simple yet powerful. True strength doesn't come from shouting or proving yourself to others. It comes from knowing your own worth and staying true to who you are. He knew that the respect he had gained from the passengers, from his crew, and even from Miss Henderson wasn't because he demanded it. It was because he had earned it by standing firm in his values, by treating others with respect, even when he wasn't given the same courtesy. As he drove home that day, Jason couldn't help but think about the countless people around the world who face similar challenges, who are judged or underestimated because of their appearance, their background, or simply because they don't fit into someone else's expectations. He knew that many of these people might feel alone, might feel as though they have to prove themselves over and over again just to be seen, just to be respected. But he also knew that these people carried a strength within them, a strength that no one could take away. It was the strength of resilience, the strength of knowing who they were, even when others couldn't see it. And Jason hoped that his story, his experience, would serve as a reminder to them that they were not alone, that their worth was not defined by anyone else's opinions or judgments. In life, we all have a choice. We can choose to let others define us, to let their judgments shape the way we see ourselves. Or we can choose to rise above it, to remain grounded in our own truth, to carry ourselves with dignity, no matter how others treat us. Jason had chosen the latter, and in doing so, he had shown everyone on that plane, including Miss Henderson, what true strength looked like. He hoped that each person who had witnessed his story would carry this lesson with them, that they would remember the power of quiet resilience, the importance of treating others with respect, and the value of looking beyond appearances. Because, as Jason knew all too well, the world would be a much better place if everyone took a moment to see the humanity in others, to look beyond the surface and recognize the beauty, the worth, and the potential in each person they encountered. As the sun began to set on the horizon, Jason felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew that this was just one chapter in his journey, that there would be more challenges, more people like Miss Henderson who would judge him without knowing him. But he also knew that he had the strength to face whatever came his way, because he had learned that true power didn't come from proving others wrong. It came from knowing, deep within, that he was already enough. For those who feel overlooked, for those who feel underestimated, Jason's story carries a simple but powerful message. You are enough. You don't need to change yourself to fit someone else's expectations, and you don't need to prove your worth to anyone. Your strength lies in your patience, in your kindness, and in your ability to stay true to yourself, even when others can't see your value. And as he thought about this, Jason couldn't help but smile, knowing that he had done more than just reclaim his own dignity. He had reminded everyone on that flight, and hopefully anyone who heard his story, of the importance of seeing each person as they truly are, of looking beyond first impressions, and respecting the quiet strength that lies within us all. True strength is quiet. True strength is patient. True strength is kind. And true strength, as Jason had shown, is unshakable. It's the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself, because it already knows its own worth. It's a strength that comes from within, a strength that shines through in the face of judgment, and a strength that, in the end, inspires others to look beyond appearances and see the humanity in each person they meet. Jason's journey had taught him that no matter where he went, no matter who he encountered, he would carry this strength with him. It was a strength that couldn't be taken away, a strength that would guide him through every challenge, every moment of doubt, and every encounter with people like Miss Henderson. And as he looked forward to the future, he knew that he would continue to live by these values, to treat others with respect and kindness, to rise above judgment, and to show the world the true meaning of dignity and respect. For Jason, this wasn't just the end of a single journey. It was the beginning of a lifelong commitment to living with purpose, with grace, and with a strength that no one could ever shake. In the end, Jason knew that his story was more than just a reminder for others. It was a reminder for himself, a reminder that no matter what challenges he faced, he would always have the power to choose his response, to choose patience over anger, kindness over bitterness, and dignity over pride. And in doing so, he would continue to inspire others to do the same, to find their own quiet strength, and to live with the same unwavering sense of purpose that had guided him on this journey. Because in the end, true strength is not about power or status. It's about knowing who you are, staying true to your values, and treating others with the respect and kindness they deserve. And Jason knew, deep in his heart, that this was a lesson worth sharing, a lesson worth living, and a lesson that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And so, with a heart full of peace and a spirit full of resilience, Jason walked forward, ready to face whatever came his way, knowing that he was already enough.